Thank you very much, Larissa. Yes, good afternoon, everybody. Yep, the subject I've chosen for today, or was asked to talk about, were mammals and birds in a changing world. But like Nick before, earlier this afternoon, I'm going to start by telling you something about how I got to where I am now. Quick summary of my career. And it started a long time ago. When I was an undergraduate in Cambridge, I took up a summer job as a lackey carrying boxes of rocks for the Cambridge Spitsbergen expedition. I went there in 1968, and this is a picture I actually took in Svalbard in 1968. And that was really the first time that I'd ever been anywhere as interesting as polar regions. So Svalbard in 1968 gave me what was my first taste of polar regions. And like many before and many since, I got totally hooked on polar regions as a place to work. So when I was looking around for a job as I graduated, I found an advertisement for a PhD study at South Georgia, obviously the other end of the world, Antarctica. I applied, got the job, and I set off to work for the British Antarctic Survey at South Georgia. So here's a photograph taken in my first winter. I spent 2.5 years at South Georgia, that's continuously, without returning to the UK, doing a PhD study on marine invertebrates. South Georgia is an absolutely brilliant place to work. But working in an isolated place like that is something of a baptism of fire for a research student. So I was there on my own. My supervisor was at the other end of the earth. So if I needed a new piece of apparatus, I had to build it. If a piece of apparatus went wrong, I had to repair it. There was no internet. Communication back home was by telex. And I think some of you may have to use Wikipedia to find out what a telex is. And my calculating device was a slide rule. So it was very, very different from the environment in which people work now. And I have to say the environment in which people work now is much better. But this was a fun time. It was what we had to hand, and I had a really good time. My animal, anyone who does a PhD on an animal always refers to it as my animal. My animal was a little benthic shrimp, and this is it, Charismus antarcticus. It's about the size of a shrimp you get in a prawn cocktail. And it's quite common at South Georgia, so we could catch good numbers of it. And I was interested in what we would call basic biology. How fast does the animal grow? It grows quite slowly. When does it breed? It breeds in summer. How long is the life cycle? 4 or 5 years, which is quite long for such a small animal. How many eggs does a female produce? Well, that varies on the size of the female. These are basic biology parameters, the things you need to understand the biology of the animal and to understand something of its population dynamics. So I did that for 3 years, returned home, wrote it up for my thesis, and was lucky enough to get a postdoc at the same institution. So unlike Nick earlier on, who was describing he moved from country to country doing postdocs before settling in Ireland, I had almost the opposite type of career in that I started in the Antarctic Survey and I finished my career in the Antarctic Survey, having been through a period of doing science management and then eventually returning back to science. So this gave me the opportunity to develop a research theme. And as often happens in the course of a 40-year career, your interests change subtly and they shift. So I started out by exploring the question of what limits the growth in polar marine invertebrates. One of the key things with that is that we didn't have any environmental information. We didn't really know much about the Antarctic marine environment, at least close to shore. So we set up an oceanographic monitoring program so that we had the environmental data we needed to understand the ecology. And I moved to doing mark recapture studies, so you can measure growth in situ, bring the animals in, mark them in the lab, put them back in the field, recover them a year later, or recover some of them a year later, and you can see how far they've grown. That was fine, kept me going for about 15, 20 years, but I broadened my interest into 2 other areas which are not immediately obviously related. One was how diverse is the polar marine fauna. I'd been told it was very depauperate, but it turned out to be very rich in species. And the second was linked to that, which was how is that diversity been influenced by glacial and geological history? And although they're quite disparate themes, there is a common link between them all, and that is the relationship between animals and temperature. And that's really what's been the centerpiece of my entire research career. It's probably not surprising I got interested in temperature, given that I started in polar regions. But what evolved recognition that understanding the relationship between organisms and temperature involves interdisciplinary work. Again, a point that Nick made earlier on this afternoon. You need to know the physics, you need to know some chemistry, you need to understand the physiology, you've got to put that in an ecological context, and all animals have a history. So you need to know the paleological history as well. Towards the end of my time, I actually got interested in a particular aspect of animals and temperature, which is the nature and the evolution of endothermy. And that's actually what's going to be the focus of my talk today. So that's just giving you a quick, brief potted history of how I got to be where I am. Now I'm going to turn to the subject of the talk. And it's going to be in 3 unequally sized bits. I want to say a little bit at the start about what is endothermy, say something about how it relates to the environment, and then finally tackle endothermy in a world that's changing. And I want to start with 2 quotations. When I was an undergraduate, the invertebrate textbook that I got given to, or we were listed to read, was Arthur Ramsey's Physiological Approach to Lower Animals. You won't find a copy of this book now, it's long out of date, but at the time it was the book, and it's a beautifully written book. And in it, Ramsey sort of wants to put the invertebrates in a context of animals that we probably know better. And he said, the mammal is a highly tuned physiological machine carrying out with superlative efficiency what lower animals are content to muddle through with. Contrast is a quotation from Monty Preet, who's a fish biologist, deep sea fishes in particular, where he says homeothermy, that's the old term, can be seen as a step towards some of the most inefficient life forms ever seen, dissipating vast amounts of energy in maintaining a body temperature simply to remain alive. So there's 2 contrasting views of endothermy there, and actually there's a grain of truth in both of them. But if we're going to talk about endothermy, we need to define our terms. And the definition I like is the maintenance of a high and relatively constant internal body temperature, where the principal source of heat is the high metabolic rate at rest. And on that basis, the only living endotherms are mammals and birds. You'll sometimes see other animals described as endothermic in the literature, but under the definition I've just given you, they're not endothermic. These include tuna fish, which retain metabolic heat generated by the muscles, bumblebees, which can generate heat by having their flight muscles work asynchronously, so they generate heat but not flight. And more interestingly, some plants, which will generate heat using mitochondria in the same way that we generate heat, but the way they generate heat in the mitochondria is quite different from the way mammals and birds generate heat. So the common theme here is that it's good to be warm if you want high performance, but only true endotherms are mammals and birds. There are lots of ways to generate heat, but only mammals and birds do it in the particular way we're interested in. Another important distinction is that while endothermy provides a warm body doesn't necessarily indicate that you're an endotherm. And that goes back to my previous slide. As an example, the varanid lizard, the monitor lizard Varanus, can maintain a body temperature of about 35 Celsius by behavioral thermoregulation, as long as there is a source of heat available for it to use. In fact, some lizards can generate a body temperature of 40 Celsius. So here is an animal that has a warm body, at least during the day, but it's not an endotherm, it's an ectotherm. So what actually determines the body temperature in an endotherm? Well, it's done like this. This little diagram here is a conceptual diagram of an animal. The green bit is the body core. The grey bit around the outside represents insulation, and the arrows represent heat flow. And for all organisms, it doesn't matter if you're an elephant, a mouse, a reptile, a fish, an insect, or a bacterium, you have the same sources of heat, and they're twofold. One is that heat flows from the environment into the animal, and the other is heat generated by metabolism. The difference between endotherms and everybody else is that in an endotherm, the primary source of heat is metabolism. In everything else, the primary source of heat is the environment. However, in all organisms, both sources are relevant. It's just the balance between them that shifts. What determines the body temperature is the balance between the incoming heat and the heat losses. In the case of endotherms, the animals that are concerning us today, then heat loss will be by radiation, conduction, and convection away from the skin. But also in the case of terrestrial organisms, there are respiratory losses through evaporation through the nose or through the lungs. So your body temperature is regulated, and it's a regulated balance between heat input and heat loss. Where that balance sits varies from species to species. This plot here is the plot of a body temperature for about 600 species of mammals and about 400 species of birds. We culled the literature for these data in 2007 and published them in 2008. We're just updating the mammal data set at the moment, and we've now got 700 species of mammal, but it doesn't change the picture you see on the screen in front of you. Two things to take away from this diagram. First is that mammals and birds don't all have the same temperature. Mammal temperatures can range from about 30 degrees, that's in a monotremes, up to about 40 degrees. And their modal temperature is about 36. Birds also show a varied temperature from about 36 Celsius, but up to 46 Celsius. So they're both varied, but birds run their bodies significantly warmer than mammals do, by about 6 degrees on average. So that's a quick introduction to endothermy. I now want to say something about endothermy and the environment. One of the first things we did with all these data was to look at the body temperature in relation to environmental temperature. And what we found was not what we expected. What we found was that body temperature was more variable in the tropics and less variable at the poles. We sort of expected it to be the other way around. A corollary here, and an important one, is of course that there are more species in the tropics than there are in the poles. So in a sense, there's more opportunity for a wider range of body temperature. That relationship or the correlation is significant, but I haven't put a line through it. And the reason being that the pattern of variation there is not ideal. In fact, it breaks some of the basic rules for fitting a linear regression line in that the variance is not equal across the X value. So I haven't fitted a line, but a simple correlation calculation indicates that that difference is significant. But I want to say something about the environment in a slightly different context here. This is Muskox. We don't actually have a body temperature region measurement for muskox, but similar animals of similar size have a body temperature of about 37 Celsius. And they can maintain this even when the outside temperature is -20. So that's a difference of about 60 degrees between the inside of the animal and the outside of the animal in winter. Pretty impressive, but it's not anywhere near as impressive as this little guy. This is black Cat Chickadee. It's a bird of the northern boreal forests. This is the American species. There is a closely related species in the boreal forests of Europe and Asia. This little guy hangs around, spends the winter in the forest. It maintains an internal body temperature of 40 when the outside temperature is -40. And this is a tiny little bird. That is a severe engineering challenge. If you had to design an instrument as an engineer to maintain that differential, it will be quite challenging. This little guy does it routinely. The source of everything, of course, is the fact that it has to have an energy intake. It's losing energy all the time. It has to gain energy. And anyone who's watched these birds in northern forests in winter will know that they spend all of their time hunting for food. They have to feed, because they need all of that energy in order to survive the non-feeding period when they roost overnight. Birds are visual predators. They can only feed by day. So it then has to sit out by night, and it uses the energy it's built by day in order to survive by night. If it doesn't find enough food, it dies by night. One of the things that's happened over the last 40 years is we've changed many of the techniques we use. And one of the great innovations for studying body temperature has been the advent of loggers. Here is some data from a logger in laughing thrush. It's a tremendous group of birds, laughing thrushes. Some of them have tremendous songs, which is their downfall because they're very popular as cage birds in Asia, which means they're not so common now in the wild. And here is some data from a Chinese study looking at a laughing thrush through the day. What you can see is its body temperature, the white dots, decline during the night, which is shown by the black bar on the bottom. They drop from about 43 degrees Celsius in the day to about 39 to 40 by night. Notice that the drop is quite steep, but then it's regulated. In other words, the bird is carefully regulating its nighttime temperature. The black dots show you its body mass during the night. The decline shows that it is burning fat in order to maintain that body temperature. So two things from this study. The first is that the body temperature drops by night, but in a regulated manner. And the second is that it's using energy to maintain that body temperature. The reason that it does this is that it requires less fat to be burnt to maintain a low temperature at night than it would do if it maintained a temperature of 43 through the night. There are always trade-offs in ecology. The trade-off here is that when it comes to in the morning, its body temperature is such that its wings and muscles don't work as well as they will do when they're coming at full body temperature during the day. It's thus open to being taken by a predator. Same is true in mammals. Small mammals have a much wider range of daily temperature range than big mammals. That's simply a function of size. Big mammals lose their heat more slowly than small mammals. So in both mammals and birds, we see a daily rhythm in body temperature. We as humans have the same. Our range is just very small. That's fine. But what we've learned from the new generation of loggers is to get an insight into what some mammals and a few birds do when times get really tough. This is data from grey mouse lemur, a tiny primate in Madagascar. The black dots at the top show you the body temperature of free-ranging, these are females as it happens, in the time of year when food is freely available. They maintain their body temperature constantly at around 36, 37 Celsius. The white plot beneath is a male in the dry season when food is not available very commonly. And you will see that it runs its body lower and it drops its temperature. In fact, it goes into torpor by night. Now, we used to think that torpor and deep hibernation were derived features. That is, they have evolved in mammals to cope with particularly tough circumstances, noticeably the poles. It turns out that that's actually not the case. Torpor is actually a basal feature of mammals, and there is some very interesting paleontological information that suggests that proto-mammals or pre-mammals also went into torpor. So the availability of these new techniques, which has broadened our understanding of body temperature variation in mammals, has also changed fundamentally our understanding of the evolutionary history of body temperatures in mammals. That's getting cold. Mammals in deserts get hot. This is some data from a study of the sand gazelle. And what you see in the upper plot is the average of a number of animals. Again, loggers have been involved here. And you can see that their body temperature reaches a minimum about 8 o'clock in the morning and then climbs rapidly during the day to get to almost 41 Celsius by day at the end of the day. So here, these animals are exposed to the midday sun. The sun is a tremendous source of heat. They can get out of that heat by moving into the shade, but trade-offs again, you can't feed if you're standing in the shade. So the trade-off is, do I stick in the shade to maintain my body temperature, or do I move into the sun to feed? And of course, they have to feed, so they move into the sun. And they have evolved the ability to allow their body temperature to rise. It doesn't seem very much, it's a few degrees, but for an animal the size of a gazelle, that's a lot of heat. And then by night, when the temperature drops outside, they can lose that heat and they cool down again. An interesting feature of this is that the increase by day is smaller when they have water available. That tells us two things. One is that cooling by evaporation is very important. And the second is that heating up is actually carrying a risk. They only heat up when there is no water available and they have to tolerate trade-offs again. So as with all summary talks like this, where you've only got a short period of time in order to talk, I've had to skip over a wide range of studies and just pick out a few that carry important points. So it's time for a summary. So what does all of this work that's been done in recent years tell us? The first is that endothermic body temperature is regulated, but it's not fixed. The second is that body temperature can be adjusted according to circumstances. The third is that availability of water and shade is crucial in tropical regions. Two other things we've learned, but which I haven't got the time to talk about today. First is that behavior can be modified, so the animals can modify what they do according to circumstances to regulate their temperature. And the second and really important thing is that interactions with other species influence the response to temperature. What this means in terms of a changing world is very important. It means that if you want to know what an organism's response to climate change is going to be, it can't be predicted by simply tracking temperature. The animals are far more sophisticated than that. They don't simply shift in response to temperature. Their responses are far more sophisticated. And I've got a couple of studies briefly to explain how that works, or some examples of how sophisticated it can be. This is a recent study taken from the NAS, and it looks at bird species in North America. The value here is the fact they have over 40 years of continuous monitoring data for these species, and there's a powerful message there for ecology. Long-term data are really important. They looked at a range of resident species, 7 of them, and a range of neotropical migrants, about 19 species. They also looked at another class of migrants, but I haven't put them on this particular slide. With the resident species, we find that the northern boundaries are moving north. That is, they appear to be responding to climate change by going northwards. The southern boundary isn't changing, so there's presumably some adaptation going on there. Their range is stable or increasing, and their populations are fine. Neotropical migrants, that is birds that breed in North America but go to the neotropics to winter, are having a very different fate. Their northern boundaries are stable, that is, they're not responding to climate change by moving north. And their southern boundaries are contracting. And this is probably because their populations are decreasing at an alarming rate. What we don't know is whether that population decline is something that's happening in the breeding range, something that's happening in the wintering range, or something that's happening in between. My second example is to develop that theme. This is the Barnacle Goose. It's a bird that's recovering from almost near extinction about a century ago when it was shot, and the population in the whole world population was reduced to probably less than 500 individuals. It's now a common bird. There are 3 populations, one in Greenland, one breeding in Svalbard, and one breeding in Novaya Zemlya. And they winter in different areas. The Greenland ones winter in Ireland, the Svalbard birds winter in Scotland, and the Novaya Zemlya birds breed in the Wadden Sea in Europe. The green line in the middle is the migration route of barnacle geese from Svalbard. And they are changing the point at which they stock up with food halfway along. It used to be a place called Helgeland in Norway. It's now moved slightly further north because the grass is available earlier in the spring further north. So they are arriving on Svalbard in reasonably good condition. They've adjusted their halfway stop. The Russian population is faring very badly. There, for a reason we don't understand, instead of stopping over in the Baltic Sea and the White Sea, they're now moving directly to Novaya Zemlya. They're arriving early, but that means then that they're arriving in poor condition. They are relying on food available in Novaya Zemlya to feed, and studies have shown now that the goslings they produce are in poor condition, and the population in Novaya Zemlya is starting to decline dramatically. So 2 examples there where the birds are behaving quite differently with different population outcomes. to emphasize how subtle some of these interrelations are. So climate change may impact migratory birds on their wintering grounds, by loss of migratory staging posts, and by changes on the breeding grounds. The example I've shown you there in the picture are the marshes at Mai Po in Hong Kong, which is an important staging ground for many breeding birds in the Arctic, but which is, as you can see, being encroached upon by human development. Climate change can affect polar endotherms through another suite of changes. Changes in the habitat, changes in the time and area they have for feeding, changes in prey distribution and abundance, and direct human interference. The world is complicated. So the take-home message from this talk, which I hope I've been able to put over, is that if we are to understand how endotherms will cope with the changing world, we need to know not just the thermal physics, we need to understand the physics, but we also need to set this in the context of the animal's individual ecology. If we don't do both, we're likely to get things wrong. So that's my talk. Thank you very much to the team for inviting me. It's been a fun talk to put together. So thank you very much to the team. And of course, I've got to say thank you to hundreds of, yes, a large number of colleagues over many years in the Antarctic Survey and many other nations. One of the nice things about working in Antarctica is you get to work with people from all sorts of nations. And of course, thank you for listening. Over to you, Larissa.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for a great talk. That was very fascinating to listen to. We're a bit behind time, but we have time for a few questions. But I just want to remind everybody that after this session, there's the e-poster session. So if you've signed up for that, please make sure that you join these sessions on time. All right, let's see what we have for questions. Nicholas Payne asked, hi Andrew, do you think young physiologists should have a future focus on learning more about why EA mechanisms, whole animal metabolic rates increase with temperature in the way it does?
Yeah, home ground question. My short answer would be yes. The caveat is that I have a particular view of the relationship between animals and temperature in terms of metabolism, and I think it's actually more complicated than it is often given. There is a relationship between resting metabolic rate and body temperature, and that's really important. And it can be encapsulated by simply saying it costs you a lot more energy to maintain a warm body than it does to maintain a cold body. That's fine, but of course, animals don't normally live under basal conditions. They have a free-ranging metabolic rate, which is 3 or 4 times their basal rate. And we don't actually know how temperature influences that other 3/4 of their metabolic rate. So although there are many simple or simplistic equations out there which link resting metabolic rate or basal metabolic rate to temperature, I don't think we know enough yet about how field metabolic rate or daily energy expenditure relates to temperature. And if I had to point a young physiologist at an uncracked problem in this particular field, that's where I'd point them.
All right, thank you. Then we have a question by an anonymous attendee. What kind of animals do you think are most at risk in a changing climate?
That's an interesting question, and it doesn't have a straightforward answer. There is a body of thought that says that tropical organisms are living closer to their limits than polar organisms are. And I think there is some good empirical evidence that that is actually so. In fact, Nick presented in his talk some interesting evidence along those lines. The caveat is, I think, there is no denying that in the long term, animals are going to be impacted by climate change. There will be some winners, there will be some losers. The caveat is that in the short term, much more important is probably direct human impact by loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat, and so on. So yes, it's a complicated thing, but the general feeling seems to be at the moment that it's going to be the tropical species that are most at risk. And I think the empirical evidence at the moment points to that, but I think there are some big unknowns as well.
All right, thank you. And then we'll take one last question. Rob Woest from the University of Amsterdam, he says, absolutely fascinating talk. I am surprised about the difference in body temperature between mammals and birds. Do you think that this is due to the higher levels of physical activity, so flying, or is this centrally regulated by the hypothalamus?
The answer to that is both. The hypothalamus will be, if you like, sets the thermostat. Why birds run their bodies warmer than mammals, we don't really know. My gut feeling is that it is exactly what you suggest, which is that I think the greater power output required by flight muscles is what dictates the higher body temperature. In general, muscles work better the warmer they are, up to a point, obviously. And so my personal view, and it is just a gut feeling, is that birds are warmer because of flight. But there is a long way to go before we really know what it is. But that's my gut feeling.